Hello, everyone. I am Emily George Bellovo from the Miami University Alumni Association. Happy virtual alumni weekend. Today, we are proud to feature the virtual alumni webinar, Inflammation, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. A big thank you to our sponsor for this webinar, the Knowles of Oxford. Your instructor today is Dr. Kyle Timmerman. Dr. Kyle Timmerman is an associate professor in kinesiology and health at Miami University. His research, funded by the National Institute on Aging, focuses on the interactions among physical activity, inflammation, aging, and the biomarkers of disease. Funding through the NIA has enabled him to involve numerous Miami graduate and undergraduate students in clinical-based research. Kyle is an alumnus of Miami University, where he received a bachelor's degree in kinesiology, zoology, and psychology. Prior to returning to Miami as a faculty member, he earned his PhD in exercise science at Purdue University and completed a postdoctoral research fellowship at the University of Texas Medical Branch. We are so thankful to Kyle Timmerman for taking the time to join us today. You'll have the option to ask questions during the webinar by clicking the Ask a Question button right on the page. Today's webinar will last about an hour and 15 minutes. With that, I turn it over to Kyle.
Thanks for the introduction, Emily. I'd like to also thank Miami's Alumni Association and JJ Slager for inviting me to speak, and thank the Knowles for sponsoring the talk. I do a lot of stuff with the Knowles, so always excited to hear their name mentioned. In addition to doing research that Emily mentioned, I teach exercise physiology at Miami University and exercise testing and prescriptions. So a lot of our students are going into physical therapy, medical school, nursing, physician's assistant. So I love the overlap between the research I do and the classes that I get to teach. Anytime that I'm going to be asked to do a talk, I always like to say, okay, who am I going to be speaking to? Who's the speaker that's going before me? And so I was a little bit alarmed when I looked at the lecture series to see, okay, I'm going to be talking to Miami alumni shortly after they've talked about making the toasted rolls, and it's approximately lunchtime. So that feels like a tough act to follow, but without further ado, I'll pull up my slides and we'll start talking about inflammation, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'll go ahead and share my slides now. All right, so inflammation, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So we've all heard about inflammation. You can hear about it all the time. But what I've noticed in talking to my students or talking to my colleagues that will do research in this area, that there's a little bit of a misunderstanding about both what inflammation is and what's its role. Is it good? Is it bad? What do we know about it? So just simply, what is inflammation? That's a question that I get from people a lot of times. Define for me what inflammation is. So went just to the dictionary, just get the dictionary, because that's probably where most people are going to look it up. I wanted to see how good of a job did Merriam-Webster do in defining what I understand to be inflammation. Not a bad definition. So they say it's a local response to cellular injury that is marked by capillary dilation, leukocyte infiltration, meaning immune cells. We'll talk about some of these a little bit that infiltrate areas of infection. And then what we're more familiar with, the heat, pain, redness, and swelling that are associated with some aspects of inflammation. Now, I always do this in my classes with students when we're talking about inflammation, kind of the Family Feud style. If we polled 100 people and asked, is inflammation good or bad? What would we see? What would people say? And I'll ask students to raise their hand for this. And not surprisingly, we get the majority of people that say what? Inflammation is bad. And so why do we have that perception of it? Because let's look at some popular media articles. So there's in Time magazine, inflammation, the secret killer, inflammation, the slow burn in tough nutrition, mood swings are worse, how mental illness might be influenced by inflammation. In some books, Reversing Inflammation Naturally, The Inflammation Cure, The Inflammation Syndrome, Life Extension, Triumph Over Chronic Inflammation. So we see all these things as we're walking out of Kroger, looking at the magazine stand. You'll see magazine covers like this. So it's not surprising that I'll see the majority of my classes, my students will say, hey, I'm going to raise my hand. Inflammation is bad. So you see all these magazines. You rarely see a magazine cover that would look like this, right? Time magazine, inflammation, a hero's tale. So for this talk, I want to discuss what do we think of in inflammation? Is it good? Is it bad? And hopefully by the end of this, you'll see that it's kind of context dependent. Depends how we're talking about it. So I guess beginning with what's its function? So let's explore that. So my talk's going to be looking at the function of inflammation, in what aspects it's good, what aspects it's bad, and then one particular aspect which can be really bad. So to help you understand the talk as we go through it, let's look at some of the key players in our discussion of inflammation. Some of these, if you've gone into your early checkup to a doctor's, you've probably heard of before. Some of them you might not have. So in research, we talk about inflammatory cytokines. So you're going to see some of these pop up in my talk. IL-6 or interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNF alpha, interleukin-1 beta are common inflammatory cytokines. Again, you'll see these in some of the slides that I'm going to share with you. So remember, those are the inflammatory cytokines. We also have some cytokines, and again, cytokines are just these proteins that are all kind of cell-to-cell communication. Some of them have anti-inflammatory effects. So IL-10, TGF-beta are examples of anti-inflammatory cytokines. Now, some values, especially this first one, you might be more familiar with because these are common clinical measures that your doctor may be looking at. C-reactive protein. In working with older adults, most of them are like, oh, yeah. I remember my doctor looking at my C-reactive protein levels. So these are clinical markers of inflammation. Others you might not be familiar with are sedimentation rate and plasma viscosity or other clinical markers that clinicians can look at to evaluate, do you have chronic low-grade inflammation? And then also oxidative stress. You might have heard of these as free radicals. These kind of go along with inflammation. Oxidative stress are why a lot of you might be taking antioxidant supplements because we want to reduce oxidative stress. Oxidative stress, examples of those are reactive oxygen species, reactive nitrogen species. They're just molecules that have an unpaired electron that can react with a number of tissues and damage them. And reactive oxygen species can stimulate an increase in inflammation. So that's why they're not inflammatory per se, but they trigger an increase in inflammation in the body. All right, so let's start off with inflammation to good. And again, this is the one that I think folks are less familiar with because we typically think of just inflammation as strictly bad. Again, from all my class, I'll see the majority of students put their hand up and say, inflammation's not good. Let's look at several instances where it is good. So let's say this is your skin or mucosal lining and you get injury to it. So my kids, I've got 3 of them, are always falling and scraping their knees up, getting splinters. So let's say that they do, their skin's punctured, they get a splinter, some bacteria or something's introduced through that opening in their skin. So this pathogen, this bacteria presented. And then what happens? We have those cells of the immune system. So example cells are these macrophages. They play an important part in especially innate immunity. So kind of our first line of immune defense. So these macrophages come into the site of the infection, and these often then can produce a lot of inflammatory proteins, including interleukin-6, TNF alpha. And so this is good. This inflammatory response that's triggered by this damage to the skin and introduction of a pathogen like bacteria, it's kind of like I think of like dispatch. It's sending out kind of alarm signals that we've got an infection in the area. And what can this prompt? It can prompt vasodilation, so increase in blood flow to the area, which you've all probably experienced. If you get a cut, it's a little infected, you might see that it swells a bit. So that's that vasodilation, it's an increase in blood flow to the area. More immune cells are going to be recruited to the area. So those initial few macrophages that get there, producing these inflammatory proteins, it's kind of like a signal, alarm bells. Like, hey, we've got an infection, I need more help over there. So there's going to be more immune cells going into the site. An increase in phagocytic activity. So it's going to be increase of immune cells just going in and essentially, you think of Pac-Man gobbling up the bacteria or the virally infected cells. Maturation of immune cells. Inflammation triggers immune cells to mature to the more active form. So again, really, really important for helping us resolve an infection. Helps with the initiation of adaptive immune response. So we've got our innate immune response, which is kind of the first line of immune defense. And then we have the adaptive or acquired, which is going to occur later. And we think of that in terms of antibody generation. So this initial inflammation helps trigger the beginning of that adaptive or acquired immune response. Helps with tissue remodeling and repair. Inflammation helps clear out the damaged tissue, and we can initiate the healing of that tissue. To initiate a fever, we'll talk about in a bit. That can be a benefit, helping us clear up, especially more of a systemic type of infection. Let's talk about that here. So fever. So again, if we get a pathogen introduced into the body, we said one of those inflammatory cytokines that are increased is interleukin-6. This cytokine in particular can help trigger a fever, so a rise in kind of our set point temperature. Again, all of us have experienced this. It doesn't feel good, but it can have some adaptive or some beneficial aspects to it. Specifically, studies have shown that an increase in fever actually helps enhance immune function. So you might not feel good, but it's going to enhance the ability of your immune system to help clear, resolve that bacteria or viral infection. It also makes you a less hospitable environment for bacteria or for viruses. So it's making it more difficult for the bacteria to grow. It's making it more difficult for the viruses to replicate. Now, what do many of us often do? As soon as we start to see our fever go up, we run to the medicine cabinet. I'm guilty of this as well. Grab some acetaminophen, Tylenol, or some Advil, some ibuprofen. Those are antipyretics. They can help us bring our fever down. So it does make us feel better, but there are a few studies. So again, these antipyretics help bring fever down. There are a few studies that suggest that, hey, if we take these antipyretics too early and bring that fever down, that might increase the duration of that bacterial or viral infection to a certain amount. That said, there's some debate over this. It doesn't appear they're going to dramatically harm yourself if you take Tylenol, ibuprofen. I'm not saying don't take those things, but just saying there are some studies out there showing if you take them too early when you first start to experience a fever, it might somewhat delay your time from recovery from the bacterial or viral infection. So again, here's another good component of inflammation. Helps trigger this fever response, enhances immune function, and is going to decrease the time that we're going to be challenged with bacterial or viral infection. All right, continuing on. We generally all know, in my area, if I always ask people, is exercise good or bad for you? It's good, and my dad always kind of jokes around, we all know exercise is good, Kyle. Why are you spending so much time studying it and telling us about this? So we know that, but each bout of exercise that we do, you might be interested to know, it actually generates an inflammatory response. So that when you do a bout of exercise, you go out for a moderate to vigorous walk, maybe you like doing swimming or what have you, exercise acutely for a transient period of time actually causes a pretty large increase in inflammatory cytokines. Some studies have shown, several fold increase in IL-6 immediately following exercise. And again, that kind of goes counter to what a lot of people think, that inflammation is bad. If exercise is good and inflammation is bad, it's hard to kind of justify, rectify these two things. But this is actually beneficial. This transient spike that we get in this cytokine IL-6, which has inflammatory properties, but what it does, it's the main trigger to stimulate the production of, and I showed this back in the player slide, interleukin-10 or IL-10. This is one of the main anti-inflammatory cytokines. So IL-6 is the trigger for that. It triggers this anti-inflammatory response. And both IL-10 and IL-6, so IL-6 can directly and indirectly through IL-10 suppress the formation of, I would say, one of the more insidious inflammatory cytokines in terms of chronic inflammation, TNF-alpha. Again, TNF-alpha plays a lot of beneficial roles, but if it's chronically elevated, it can be a bad thing. So again, in response to exercise, we get this inflammatory response, especially with IL-6, but it triggers this inflammatory response, which might be one of the things that underlies the beneficial effects, the anti-inflammatory effects of regular physical activity or exercise. So again, another good component of inflammation. Not only does a bout of exercise increase inflammation directly, it also increases oxidative stress. So when we're exercising, our mitochondria, in your physiology class in the past, you might have heard these things like the powerhouse of the body. They're cranking out ATP to provide us with the energy to exercise, to do cellular work. But it's also the main site for oxidative stress. The majority of free radicals are generated in the mitochondria. So when we are exercising, the mitochondria are kind of revved up and we're producing even more oxidative stress. So like inflammation, immediately after a bout of exercise, if we look at markers of oxidative stress, they're elevated immediately after exercise, just for a transient period of time. And intuitively, you might think, oh, that doesn't sound like a good thing. Higher increase in these markers of oxidative stress. And kind of like with the increase in inflammation acutely after exercise, this generates a beneficial effect. It triggers these transcription factors that are sensitive to oxidative stress. And a transcription factor is just something within the cell that can travel into the nucleus and cause the increased production of certain things. In the case of transcription factors that are sensitive to oxidative stress, they can go into the nucleus and trigger an increase in endogenous antioxidants. So these are antioxidants within our body that protect us from free radical generation. Examples of these include superoxide dismutase, glutathione peroxidase, and catalase. These are more powerful antioxidants than the antioxidant supplements or exogenous antioxidant supplements that you might take. So if we can increase these, we're dramatically protecting our body, over time from oxidative damage caused by an increase in oxidative stress. So again, inflammation in this case is good. That acute increase in oxidative stress / inflammation drives as a trigger for some of these beneficial adaptations of exercise. And just to show you some data from our lab specific to this, so this is, we have this paper in review right now at the Journal of Physical Activity and Health. In these three figures, we were looking at superoxide dismutase, glutathione peroxidase, and catalase, those three endogenous antioxidants. And this was about in 30 older adults. We also looked on the x-axis here in each of these figures is how physically active they reported that they were. And so the farther we go to the right on these axes, the more physically active those folks were. And for each of these endogenous antioxidants, we noticed that the more physically active that they reported they were on a regular basis, the higher levels of these endogenous antioxidants they had in skeletal muscle. We did muscle biopsies to look at these. So again, that's related to the previous slide. It's based on work from others suggesting, physical activity may bolster our endogenous antioxidant defense system. In addition to looking at these endogenous antioxidants, we also wanted to look at, let's look at a marker of oxidative damage we might see in the body. An example of one of those, there's no test at the end of this, but just trust me, this 8-oxo-DG is a marker of oxidative damage to DNA. And we found that people that were more physically active, that had higher expression of these endogenous antioxidants, had a lower accumulation of oxidative damage to DNA. So while vitamin E, other antioxidants you might be able to get over the counter, there might be some data showing those are effective. If you just remain more physically active, it looks like you can dramatically increase your endogenous antioxidant defense system, help protect you from oxidative damage as we age. Continuing on, inflammation the good. So again, hopefully you're noticing, wow, there's a lot that I didn't know of that related to inflammation. It's actually good or beneficial for our body. For those of you that might be medical doctors or researchers in the crowd, this one goes a little bit more down the rabbit hole. So again, we said that in response to an infection, we need to be able to generate an acute inflammatory response. Well, a specific receptor plays an important role in that. That's TLR4 or toll-like receptor 4. This receptor, it's able to respond to bacteria. So when bacteria enter the body and components of those are introduced to immune cells that have toll-like receptor 4 on them, that stimulates a series of events that results in that cell increasing its production of inflammatory cytokines to generate that initial beneficial inflammatory response to an infection. So this bacteria can trigger that inflammatory response. But in addition to responding to bacteria, toll-like receptor 4 can also respond to things that we find naturally within our bodies. Examples of those are oxidized LDL. And probably heard of LDL, the bad cholesterol. Oxidized LDL is even a worse version of that. It's a form of LDL that's been oxidized by those things we were talking about in the previous slides. Free radicals, reactive oxygen species. And this can contribute to increase the likelihood of building cardiovascular disease. We also they can also respond to advanced glycated end products. You can find those on that char. You grill a hamburger and you get that char, which is delicious. It has a high amount of these advanced glycated end products, which can also trigger this inflammatory response. And heat shock protein 60 is another endogenous ligand of this, especially oxidized LDL and advanced glycated end products. As we age, or as we're less physically active, or eat less healthily, we see that those levels can accumulate. And that might be one of the things that underlie a slow, steady increase in our baseline levels of inflammation as we age. So, Kyle, you said this is inflammation, the good. Well, this ties back to what we talked about with exercise. In studies that I've done and that others have done, you take folks that have not been regularly physically active, that have pretty high levels of baseline inflammation. If we exercise train them, I've done studies up to 3 months. We're working on right now a 6-month training study for people that are just regularly physically active. It appears that that can reduce the expression and the activity of toll-like receptor 4 to these endogenous antioxidants. So that initial acute inflammatory response to exercise can actually help kind of tamp down the responsiveness of toll-like receptor 4 to these endogenous antioxidants. So again, this is a good role. The acute inflammatory response can help decrease the sensitivity of this receptor to ligands that can contribute to that chronic low-grade inflammation we'll talk about in a bit is more associated with disease. All right, let's look at inflammation bad. So probably things that you're more familiar with. Think back to that Time magazine cover, inflammation, the silent killer. That's tied to some of the things that I'm going to talk about here. So let's start kind of with the king of chronic disease, cardiovascular disease. Most of you probably have a good understanding of what this is. But here's just a figure that, healthy artery, coronary artery, no restriction to flow, adequate blood and oxygen can be delivered to the myocardium of the heart. But if we start to develop atherosclerosis and the formation of plaques within those coronary arteries, we struggle to deliver sufficient oxygen and blood to the myocardium, which can eventually result in a myocardial infarction, damage to the myocardium, or more colloquially, you can experience a heart attack. So again, that's cardiovascular disease. It's the number one killer in the U.S. So 650,000 Americans die each year from cardiovascular disease. That's about more around 23%. So nearly a quarter of annual deaths per year from cardiovascular disease. And then, kind of putting a dollar cost on that, estimates are that's costing the U.S. around $220 billion per year in medical costs. And as I'm going to show now, inflammation plays a role in the development, pathogenesis, and the progression of cardiovascular disease. So let's say this is a coronary artery. And if we look over to the far left, let's say this is your healthy coronary artery. No damage to it. Blood flows through there really well. Let's say that now as we progress this way, we get to an area where there's some damage. For instance, high blood pressure can damage the lining of your arteries. When we get that damage, that can initiate an inflammatory response. So those immune cells are, hey, we've got some damage to tissue over here. Our job is to go and try to heal that. So they go to those areas, they bind to that damage in the coronary artery, they start producing these inflammatory proteins. It's going to call more immune cells to this area. Well, those macrophages that are recruited to the area can then start to infiltrate into that endothelial lining. Not only do they start to infiltrate in there, but they start to gobble up LDL cholesterol. And they develop into these larger cells called foam cells. You can see a foam cell starting to form here. And the accumulation of these foam cells over time within that endothelial lining underlie the development of plaques that are kind of hallmark of atherosclerosis and hallmark of cardiovascular disease. So in this regard, in a person who has chronically elevated inflammation, they are more likely to develop these atherosclerotic plaques and develop cardiovascular disease. And then taking it out farther, are more likely to suffer myocardial infarction or significant cardiovascular disease. So inflammation clearly plays a role, especially chronically elevated inflammation, plays a role in development of cardiovascular disease. Let's look at this more closely. So one of those clinical markers, C-reactive protein. Again, many of you, if you've gone to your doctors on a daily basis, have probably had this measured. And this kind of hallmark study by Ridker and colleagues, they looked at nearly 28,000 apparently healthy women. They measured their baseline levels of C-reactive protein. They followed them for 8 years. And they said, okay, who's having a myocardial infarction, stroke, who needs a coronary revascularization, how many people are dying from cardiovascular disease. So then they looked at that data, and then on the y-axis in both of these, it's looking at probability of dying over that time. So here's at the beginning of the study, everybody's alive. They're following these folks over the 8 years and saying, okay, based on their C-reactive protein level, who's dying, who's not. And this first figure, they're looking at quintiles of C-reactive protein. So quintile 1 are those folks that had the lowest level of C-reactive protein. And quintile 5 are those folks that had the highest level of C-reactive protein at the beginning of the study. And you can clearly see that those folks that had the highest level of C-reactive protein were at increased risk for dying over the course of that 8-year study. And this study was one of the first to say, let's try to come up with some clinical cut points. So they broke them into folks that had C-reactive protein less than 1 milligram per deciliter, between 1 and 3, and greater than 3 milligrams per deciliter. And those are kind of the clinical cut points that your doctor will look at during your yearly checkups. If your value comes back less than 1, you might look green and say, you're good to go. 1 to 3, you might see a yellow, something show up on your yearly blood work. If it's over 3, it might be showing a red. It's letting your physician know that, hey, based on your C-reactive protein levels, you're at elevated risk of development of cardiovascular disease. And so by the same group, this is a different study, again, looking at, now this case, over 28,000 postmenopausal women. They followed them for 3 years to assess risk of cardiovascular events. They looked at a number of proteins associated with cardiovascular risk. And what these values on the x-axis, this is your relative risk of developing cardiovascular disease or having a cardiovascular event. So 1, that would be those folks that did not have elevations of these things. And we're comparing that to folks in the study that did have elevated total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, CRP, ApoB. You see, okay, compared to people that did not have elevations of these, if people did have elevations, what was their increased risk? So if we look at LDL cholesterol, for instance, people that had elevated LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, were at roughly 2-fold increased risk of developing cardiovascular disease over the period of this study. Now, what about CRP? Well, you can see CRP is of these things that we're looking at, has even more pronounced effect. So people that had elevated C-reactive proteins, so greater than 3, this study were 4 times more likely to develop cardiovascular disease or have a cardiovascular event over the 3 years of this study. So again, that's why your doctor is looking at this as a clinical marker of inflammation to assess what your risk is in developing cardiovascular disease. All right, well, I'm going to pause here for a second to see if you have any questions to this point. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if you guys do have any questions.
Hello, we've had a few questions come in. Bob asked, can Dr. Timmerman please talk about the application of ice, when to use it, how to use it, etc.?
Yeah, so you've probably heard of RICE for treating things. So rest, ice, in elevation. So if you have some kind of an acute injury, say you have an ankle sprain or you have chronically aching knees caused by arthritis, we'll talk about arthritis more specifically in a little bit, that can help with those acute symptoms. So sprained ankle, sure, especially if you can apply pressure, that's going to help with that acutely to help minimize some of that swelling, that discomfort we have associated with inflammation. So ice is absolutely helpful for helping to reduce that swelling, that pain or discomfort you have with acute injury like an ankle sprain, or for chronic flare-ups more associated with osteoarthritis or something like that. So ice can help with those chronic symptoms.
Margaret asks, has a relationship been observed between inflammation and hormones?
Yeah, that's some of those data are a little bit equivocal, meaning as with some studies, you'll see some studies will show one way and some studies will show another. So Margaret, specific to postmenopausal women, it looks like we see some declines in some hormones associated with menopause. it does look like there's some elevations in some of these inflammatory cytokines to some bit. And if using some of these hormonal treatments, they're often given when someone will hit menopause, you can see that inflammation can resolve somewhat. So it does. Now, the exact mechanism for those things are still a little bit of a topic for debate, but that's a great question. There is research looking specifically at that, and it does look like there might be a link.
And last one for this round, Sandra Lee asked, how did you become interested in studying inflammation?
So it was actually when I was here as an undergraduate student, I took a class with Dr. Cox. So Dr. Ron Cox in our department was his exercise physiology class. And inflammation came up during that time. And I was doing research in the biology department as well. So I was really interested in research. So I just started diving into, after hearing about that Dr. Cox's exercise physiology class, just on my own, nerd that I am, looking up some more research articles on inflammation and immune function. I saw research at Purdue University. I wasn't a big fan of Purdue. I'm more of a Ohio State fan, but I was really interested in the research that he was doing there. And so I went to Purdue, wanted to learn more about the relationship between physical activity, aging, and inflammation. And then just really got excited about there and just kind of started my trajectory. But initially, it was here at Miami that I got interested in.
Great. So we have a couple of questions for the end, but again, as a reminder to the audience, you can ask a question throughout the webinar. Right underneath the video is an ask the question button, and I am getting that feed. So please feel free for any kind of curiosity or questions, send them my way.
Great, I'll jump back in.
Great.
All right. So continuing on with inflammation, the bad, diabetes. So again, the inflammation is really linked to a number of chronic diseases, especially that chronically elevated inflammation. So here we're not talking about that acute response to inflammation, response to an infection, or response to exercise. This is chronically elevated inflammation. We do know that it's linked to diabetes. And again, it's a major issue. Specifically, we usually are talking about type 2 diabetes because it accounts for the lion's share of diabetes, about 90 to 95% of the cases. And this is the one that's more inflammatory related of the two types of diabetes, more than two, but we think of type 1 and type 2. Type 2 is especially related to inflammation. Again, just basically what is it? Your body can still produce insulin if you have type 2 diabetes, but your tissues just become resistant to it. Especially your muscle and your liver just become resistant to that signal of insulin. And what is that signal of insulin? So insulin tells our tissues to take up and store glucose. So when we develop insulin resistance, one of the hallmarks is chronically elevated blood glucose. So these tissues are resistant to the effect of insulin, which is telling them to kind of slurp up glucose from the blood, take it into the tissue, and store it. And what are the consequences of that? That's the thing I notice many of my students aren't that familiar with. That elevation in blood glucose damages nerves, damages blood vessels, and as such, it increases our risk for cardiovascular disease, stroke, blindness, kidney disease, infections, a number of not good consequences associated with that. Prevalence, about 10.5% of the population has diabetes. And again, staggering annual costs associated with it. Now, as I'll show here, inflammation plays a role. So let's look at it just quickly. So here's an insulin receptor. Let's say it's on a muscle cell. When you eat a meal, say a toasted roll from Miami, that's going to cause your blood glucose levels to go up. Your pancreas is going to produce insulin in response to that. Going to be a series of events happen intracellularly, which then causes a receptor or a transporter called GLUT4 to go to the surface of the cell in a muscle, and then glucose can then leave the blood, so your blood glucose levels come down, and that glucose enters the muscle where it can be stored away. So in somebody who's normally insulin sensitive, this helps us regulate our blood glucose levels. But if we have chronically elevated inflammation, kind of this inflammation pathway shown here in red, we know that this can impair insulin receptor signaling. So if you have chronically elevated inflammation, that's one of a number of things that can lead to the development of insulin resistance, inflammation of type 2 diabetes. Something more specific that I look at is sarcopenia, which is age-related loss of muscle mass and function. And so we specifically look at what's the person's muscle mass? Do they have impairments in gait speed and in grip strength to diagnose sarcopenia? It's associated with increased risk of falls, fractures, decreased quality of life, increased morbidity, and decreased independence, which is one of the big triggers, especially for older adults. If they see that something is going to impair their independence, that usually gets their antennas up, because that's oftentimes that is more of a concern than their mortality risk. They want to be independent as long as through their life as much as they can. What's the prevalence? It's kind of over the board, but a number of studies I've shown here, probably somewhere between 25 to 30% of older adults have some level of the sarcopenia, age-related loss of muscle mass and function. And so what determines whether or not we lose or gain muscle mass is kind of our fluctuation between periods of muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. Kind of the balance of those two things, synthesis of muscle and breakdown of muscle, we call protein net balance. So when you wake up in the morning, you're in a period of net negative balance. You're breaking down more muscle than you're synthesizing. You wake up and have breakfast, and that shifts to a positive balance. And so this fluctuates back and forth between net periods of synthesis and breakdown throughout the day. And meals that you can eat or activity that you do can help shift these peaks of synthesis up to a greater degree. But for most of us, these peaks and valleys balance one another out, and we maintain muscle mass. But as we age, this becomes a struggle. We become less responsive to the anabolic or the stimulating effects of nutrient intake or muscle contraction. And inflammation may play a role in that. So TNF-alpha, I mentioned that earlier, it's an inflammatory cytokine. It's also sometimes called cachectin or cachexia, which is disease-related breakdown of tissue. So TNF-alpha can play a role in the breakdown of muscle. So through a number of ways, TNF-alpha impairs endothelial function. So in response to nutrient intake, our blood vessels typically dilate in the muscle and allow for an increase in amino acid delivery, which can stimulate muscle protein synthesis. But TNF-alpha can impair that. It doesn't let the vessels in the muscles vasodilate as much, so you can't deliver amino acids as well to the muscle. So you're not going to get as much muscle protein synthesis if you have chronically elevated TNF-alpha. So TNF-alpha can impair muscle protein synthesis indirectly through impairing endothelial function, or directly just through gunking up the molecular machinery associated with muscle protein synthesis. It also stimulates the other side of that net balance coin. In addition to impairing synthesis, it increases the rate of muscle protein breakdown, which overall is going to impair our maintenance of skeletal muscle mass as we age. So inflammation plays a role in the loss of muscle mass and function as we age. Dementia, another obvious concern with the age. So dementia has a number of categorizations. The main one is Alzheimer's is the most prevalent form. Is dementia in general is our impaired ability to think, remember, and make decisions that impairs a person's everyday activities. Prevalence of dementia, I think this is Alzheimer's specific dementia. Again, that's the most prevalent form, was 5 million people in 2014. That's expected to triple by the year 2060. It has a staggering cost again on annual cost, medical costs, both direct and indirect, estimated for 2020 around $305 billion medical costs, both direct and indirect, associated with dementia. It's the sixth leading cause of death in the U.S. as well, which I don't think many people realize. Again, inflammation clearly plays a role in the development and progression of dementia. So we have chronically elevated systemic or central nervous system inflammation. See elevations of TNF-alpha, IL-1 beta, PGE2, another inflammatory protein. We know the neurocognitive side is not the side that I look at as much, but researchers have shown that chronic elevation of these inflammatory proteins can lead to microglial or neuron dysfunction within the brain and the central nervous system, which obviously can lead to cognitive decline. So again, this is why when we hear many people hear inflammation, they think bad, because it is tied to a number of chronic diseases and conditions, including dementia. Arthritis is probably the most common question I get. And we got the one about ice, right? A lot of us, including me, once I hit 40, I feel like my warranty expired, are dealing with arthritis. So inflammation, swelling, pain, stiffness in joints. clearly has an inflammatory role. And I think this one, many people were more aware of that it has a direct inflammatory relationship. The most common forms of arthritis are osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis. Prevalence in adults, 22.7% of adults suffer from some form of arthritis. Annual costs, again, medical costs, lost wages, lost productivity, again, staggering number. It was estimated to be $303 billion in 2013. And as with those other chronic conditions, there's an inflammatory linkage. Rheumatoid arthritis, that's an autoimmune condition. And with autoimmune diseases, it's essentially that your immune system, which usually goes, that cell's me, leave it alone, that cell's me, leave it alone. There's a bacteria or viral infected cell, I'm going to go attack that. Your immune cells lose the ability to distinguish between you and not you. And so in the case of autoimmune diseases, they start to attack you or your tissues. That's the case with rheumatoid arthritis. The autoimmune disease, your immune system doesn't recognize you and will start to attack your cells. You'll get inflammation of the joints, which will lead to tissue degradation. Osteoarthritis is not autoimmune. It's just from wear and tear. So you get tissue damage. When we were in our 20s, you get that tissue damage and you could heal pretty quickly. Inflammation will play an important role in tissue remodeling, but as we age, as we get wear and tear, you're going to get that inflammation, but we're less able to heal that damaged tissue. And so inflammation remains elevated in those joints. And in both cases, whether it's rheumatoid arthritis or osteoarthritis, we get that chronic elevation of these inflammatory proteins. And that leads to tissue damage and then pain and disability associated with rheumatoid arthritis or osteoarthritis. So clear inflammatory linkage with arthritis. Now, let's look in the extreme. So this is the ugly portion of the talk related to inflammation. Sometimes this immune response, if you have an infection, can snowball out of control. And you probably have heard of this sepsis before. That's essentially what it is. It's where we get an extreme immune response to an infection. So we're just getting, an exponential increase in these inflammatory proteins rather than kind of a normal increase that's going to help us deal with the infection. So consequence of this large increase in inflammation, if it's not treated quickly, it can rapidly lead to tissue damage and organ failure in the span of hours. So sepsis, if it develops, needs to be treated quickly. People with impaired immune function are more susceptible to this. Older adults are more susceptible to this. People with some chronic diseases are more susceptible to sepsis. But again, this is a rampant, out of control increase in inflammation in response to an infection, which has serious consequences. About 1.7 million adults in America develop sepsis per year. Mortality, around 270,000 Americans die per year from sepsis. So again, probably more than you would have thought if you've heard about sepsis before. All right, so these last couple slides in this part, it's kind of a question: inflammation, friend or foe, based on what we talked about to this point. So it's hopefully you've learned from what I'm talking about. It's context dependent. It's context dependent. So some examples we've talked about: if you get an infection, you get an increase in inflammation, and over the period of days, that's going to help resolve that infection. When that infection is resolved, inflammation goes back down to baseline. This is an example of it's your friend. This is helping resolve an infection, whether it's bacterial or viral infection. In that context, acute increase in inflammation response to infection, inflammation is good. If we couldn't produce that inflammatory response, we would all be immunocompromised. So it's important that we can generate that acute inflammatory response to an infection. In response to exercise, again, a lot of people are surprised to learn that each bout of exercise that we do actually generates, again, somewhat dependent on the intensity of the exercise, a pretty potent inflammatory response. But again, it's acute, it's transient. It'll go up, it'll be elevated for a couple hours, and it'll return back down to baseline levels. So that, and as we said before, that transient spike in inflammation drives a number of the positive beneficial aspects we associate with physical activity and exercise. So in this context, inflammation is our friend. The acute response of inflammation to a bout of exercise. That's a good thing. Now, when is it our foe? So that's, now look on here, I don't have days, this is years. if we see our baseline levels start to creep up, so it's our baseline level of inflammation steadily starting to go up, that's the type of inflammation that we associate with increased risk of chronic disease, such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, dementia, sarcopenia, arthritis. And what can lead to this increase in baseline levels of inflammation? If we become overweight as we age, obesity, or we believe contribute to this chronic rise in inflammation with aging. If we're less physically active, or if we're physically inactive, that can contribute to this rise in inflammation as we age. And in some people, it just have certain immune dysfunction, too high expression of cells that produce a lot of inflammation. Those folks we can see a little more susceptible to these diseases because we're seeing their baseline levels of inflammation creep up over time. So when you see those articles, Inflammation, the Silent Killer, or the books that are saying, the cure for inflammation, they're specifically talking about this type of inflammation. Again, sometimes called chronic low-grade inflammation or sterile inflammation. This in particular is the bad type of inflammation. So another way that I like to think about, most of the time that I'm talking with the groups of older adults, I go to the Knolls to speak quite a lot. So I try to put it in context for the audience for them to understand. And this is, you'll see this is really applicable now. I've got my oldest son is at my parents right now. He's staying at his grandparents for a week. So to help you understand this, inflammation, good or bad. So think of this. Again, we said an acute, transient increase in inflammation is a good thing. And it's similar to seeing your grandkids for one day. That's a great thing. Everybody's happy. Versus having your entire week with your grandkids. That can be a kind of a bad thing. Sometimes it's even more stressful. So it's context dependent, much like time with your grandkids for inflammation. There's acute responses to infection or exercise, beneficial. Chronically elevated inflammation, that's the bad type of inflammation. So what are we doing at Miami? Just to wrap up, we're talking specific to this. So as Emily mentioned at the beginning, I involve a lot of students in my research. Here's Ian doing some Western blots, Melanie, Matt, and Gabby helping out with the muscle biopsy we're doing as part of research. This picture was actually snapped by President Crawford. He came over to see what we were doing one day. Here's our nutrition students, some of them, Denise and Hannah, doing diet analysis for part one of our weight loss studies, and Vince right before one of the exercise training sessions with some of our subjects. So we're looking at what's the role of lifestyle modification, weight loss, diet, exercise training on inflammation. And specifically, we're looking at something novel called TNF-alpha converting enzyme, or TACE. And that plays an important role in activating or turning on the active form of TNF-alpha. That's one of the cytokines we talked about quite a bit. TACE has not been looked at much in humans. We've been one of the first groups to look at this, especially in skeletal muscle within humans, and its potential role in the development of chronic inflammation as we age. Here's a study we published recently. We found that older adults had higher body fat percentage, were less physically active, had higher expression of that enzyme that activates TNF-alpha in their muscle. So it's kind of a novel molecular pathway. And the better we can understand these pathways, clinically speaking, that's more potential points of intervention for clinical populations for treating inflammatory-related diseases. Like receptor 4 in that same paper as well. Again, that's that immune receptor that can respond to bacteria, but can also respond to things that accumulate in our body as we age, like oxidized LDL. We found that the higher a person's body fat percentage, the greater the expression of this receptor that can contribute to that increase in inflammation as we age. And to look at this in more detail, right now we have an ongoing clinical trial funded by National Institute on Aging, where we're recruiting older adults that are getting randomized to diet-induced weight loss, an exercise group for 6 months, or a combo pack of diet and exercise. And we also have a control group. Those are the subjects that get cranky with us. We told them they've been randomized to the group that doesn't get these nifty interventions. But we do give them the interventions at the end, so they still get those. So it's fun. We're able to look at Miami, again, largely with undergraduate students and some of our graduate students, the role of lifestyle modification in helping us prevent this chronic low-grade inflammation, and by extension, reducing our risk of development of chronic diseases as we age. So thanks for letting me talk with you guys this afternoon about this. And if you have any more questions, please let me know. With that, I'll pop off of sharing to see if Emily has any more questions.
We did have some questions. So Elizabeth would like to know, what is your opinion of an anti-inflammatory diet? Can it help bad inflammation without impending good inflammation?
Yeah, it absolutely can. And that's a great question, especially the last part of that, because when I talked about inflammation to good, the natural question I'll get sometimes people is like, well, should I be taking anti-inflammatory medications, or maybe taking blueberries is bad, Kyle, because I might prevent this inflammatory response to an infection. It's not. So there are a bunch of anti-inflammatory foods. So you see a lot of foods like, again, blueberries is a common one you'll see that have exogenous anti-inflammatories that can reduce inflammation, that can reduce oxidative stress. And again, that data is always somewhat equivocal. It kind of depends on the population that they're looking at. Were they deficient in those things to begin with, as to whether or not they have a beneficial effect on reducing the development of inflammatory-related diseases or oxidative stress. So it just depends. That data is somewhat equivocal. And again, the main things that kind of vary with that is the dosage they're giving, whether or not those people were deficient in those to begin with. So there are clearly some foods out there that do have beneficial anti-inflammatory effects. I have not seen data that suggests that would impair the good aspect of it. So if you're taking a lot of blueberries or an anti-inflammatory supplement, that does not seem that it wouldn't impair the acute increase in inflammation in response to an infection, which is good, or it wouldn't impair that acute response that we get to exercise. There's actually been some people that have looked at that. Do these anti-inflammatories decrease IL-6 in response to exercise? And I've really not seen that there's any evidence that it does do that. You really wouldn't want it to, because again, that acute rise in exercise, inflammation response to exercise generates or causes over time this beneficial effects of exercise. But that's a great question.
Rob would like to ask, how bad are regularly swollen hot joints, such as knees, for the rest of your body?
So how bad are they for the rest of your body? Mm-hmm. I don't think that, so if I'm understanding that question, it's right, it's like saying if you have osteoarthritis or rheumatoid arthritis, there's localized inflammation, elevated inflammation in joints, you're not going to see that's not going to dramatically, there's not a lot of spillover, I should say. You're not going to say, hey, that inflammation is being generated in the joints is going to dramatically increase my circulating levels of TNF-alpha or IL-6 and contribute to my development of cardiovascular disease. You don't really typically see, for example, arthritis as a risk factor for development of cardiovascular disease. So while it is uncomfortable, and I sympathize because I have arthritis in my hip, it doesn't appear that inflammation is going to spill over systemically and cause an issue. That inflammation is largely going to remain localized.
And then we have Rachel, who's a geriatric PT. So all the things that you're saying are very relevant to her. Has a three-part question for you. The first one is, can inflammation be stalled or reversed? And if so, how long does it take with some diligence?
So all of us, even when we're perfectly healthy and we don't have an infection, have some baseline levels of inflammation. So there's always, and that's not a bad thing, we'll have some inflammation. So by reversed, I'm going to assume that you mean that chronic low-grade inflammation that we develop as we age. That can be changed pretty rapidly. So in studies that I've done, we've taken older adults that were physically inactive, relatively sedentary, and oftentimes they were overweight, and then we'll have them do exercise training. And we've seen in as little as 3 months of exercise training, in a lot of our studies, that's 3 days per week of moderate intensity exercise for roughly 30 to 45 minutes per session. So oftentimes people enrolled in those studies were like, that's all I have to do. It didn't seem like it was that much. I thought it was going to be harder to do exercise. In those 3 months doing that pretty tolerable level of exercise, we've seen in our studies their levels of inflammation get back down to levels you will see in in older adults who have been regularly physically active. So in a relatively short period of time, again, we've not titrated this out perfectly, but I can say that I've seen it in as little as 3 months that we see that we'll get these folks levels of inflammation back down to, let's say we're looking at C-reactive protein, where they might have had clinically elevated C-reactive protein that we know is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, to in a period of 3 months that it's back down to that low level of risk. Now, interestingly, and I would love to follow up on this, is fewer studies have looked after those interventions. How quick does it go away when we stop doing those things? So, it goes away pretty quickly. I can't say much. I can't give you an informed response what we see less than 3 months, just because I've not looked at that. Not many studies have looked at, hey, do we see a massive reduction in a week or 2 weeks? A lot of these studies are looking, 3 months, 6 months, or a year for those things. So relatively quickly, in my mind, we can reduce their risk of it. And I would say physical activity and weight loss appear to be more powerful levers for reducing our inflammation than dietary, in terms of taking in endogenous or exogenous antioxidants, or pharmaceutical interventions. That we see weight loss and physical activity have a big lever for reducing our inflammation in a relatively, and I can't say much less than 2 months, but a short period of time. Again, great question.
Second one, which you kind of got at earlier, talking about blueberries. How effective are supplements or foods that tout anti-inflammatory properties like turmeric?
Yeah, turmeric is a big one, and it gets so tricky when you're looking at these I call them nutraceutical studies, where they're looking at what's the beneficial effect of turmeric or blueberries, because the studies vary so widely. That's why people kind of get frustrated sometimes with these studies, because they'll say, hey, I read a study 1 week and it said taking vitamin E is going to decrease my risk of cardiovascular disease. And I read one, a year later that says I should stop taking vitamin E because it's decreasing my cardiovascular disease. So people want to throw their hands in the air and say, okay, I shouldn't try any of this stuff. So it's hard for me to give you an answer on these. Though I will say, I think that with our interventions in the future, we're going to start getting more specific to a person. So rather than just saying, I'm going to throw 1,000 international units of vitamin E down a person's system or have them consume this much turmeric, say, is that person vitamin E deficient to begin with? Maybe they don't need any. Do they have elevated levels of inflammation to begin with? In the clinical trials, and there have been some showing things like turmeric or curcumin decrease inflammation. What were those people's baseline levels of inflammation to begin with? So some of the studies that have shown no effect might have accidentally recruited people that didn't have much of a level of inflammation to begin with, whereas others might have recruited older, overweight population that had elevated levels of inflammation and caused a decrease. And then the third thing you have to look at is, what was the dosage? A lot of these studies, you'll look at it and say, oh, okay, we don't look at it. We just see that the takeaway. Oh, blueberry consumption or turmeric consumption reduces inflammation. But then if you go look at the dosage, and if you would do some math and say, oh, okay, I have to eat 5 pounds of blueberries a day to get this equivalent effect, because they were using, concentrated blueberry extract. So you kind of have to look at the dosage. So again, you're probably going to leave this answer a little bit disappointed, because it's impossible to give a direct answer on this. If you're a person that has high levels of inflammation, and yeah, some of those are going to be more beneficial for you, but you really need to then also look at, the dosage, or what type of supplement were those studies. There's different types of vitamin E. One type of vitamin E has been shown to be more effective than another. So did you buy the right supplement? Are you taking the right dosage of turmeric as part of it? So again, it's more of a mixed bag. It really depends. And I'm not trying to be evasive. It's just not, it depends on a lot of things, whether or not they're effective.
Rachel's final question is, any type of exercise better or worse? Is there a minimal exertion level or duration that you should be doing it?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. It's like a whole nother talk that I do oftentimes, like, what is physical activity? What is exercise? And how much do we need? That's kind of always the big takeaway. I've done exercise training studies in older adults and younger adults. that have had both aerobic exercise, so walking on the treadmill, or resistance exercise. So usually that would involve 4 upper and 4 lower body exercises 3 times a week at moderate intensities on those. So the general recommendation for aerobic type exercise, and that's the one most people focus on, that's where the most research is with aerobic type exercise, is trying to accumulate roughly 150 minutes per week of moderate to vigorous exercise. Now, this can freak people out because 150 minutes sounds like a lot. And so you're picturing, oh man, I have to go to the rec center whenever the heck that opens back up, or hop on my treadmill and do 150 minutes of dedicated exercise on those things. But a lot of the activities you're probably already doing. If you like golfing, you pull your clubs. For many of you, that's going to have you in the moderate to vigorous range. And so that would count towards your accumulation of 150 minutes of exercise. So again, that 150 minutes per week didn't just get plucked out of the air. We see that's where we start to see the greatest dose effect. The curve for benefit really starts to take off when we can get to that. Again, it can sound daunting, but again, a lot of your normal activities of daily living that you do are probably within that range. So look up things, those of you that are interested in calculating exercise intensity based on percentage of heart rate reserve, and you can find simple ways to calculate what might be moderate intensity for you. And then once you find your heart rate range, it's moderate intensity for you, time after time, folks will say to me, that wasn't as hard as I thought. That's all the harder I had to exercise to do that. And again, you want to accumulate over a 7-day period, that 150 minutes per week. And now another point of that is like, how long does one bout have to be beneficial? There's some more recent evidence saying out there that even bouts as little as 5 minutes at a time count towards that accumulation of 150 minutes per week and can have the same beneficial effect compared to if you accumulated that 150 minutes through 5 30-minute bouts per week. You can get the same benefit if you did, multiple smaller bouts of 5 minutes at moderate intensity over the course of a week to accumulate to 150 minutes. So again, biggest takeaway there is it's not as much as you think. It's not as much as you think. And the majority of studies that have looked at the beneficial effect of exercise on our risk of disease and mortality, the number one type of exercise they've looked at has been walking. So not training for a triathlon, the majority of the time those studies are walking. All of us can get up to typically our moderate intensity range by just going out and doing maybe a little bit more of a brisk walk, right to the point where it might become a little bit difficult for you to carry on the conversation.
Julie asks, is there a negative effect of taking ibuprofen prior to exercise?
Oh, that's another really interesting question. And I love that you guys are asking questions that I've got these direct stories I can answer. When I was at Purdue, I'll make this one quick, we saw one of the Trappy brothers, I can't remember, it was Todd or Scott Trappy from Ball State University. They're researchers there, prolific researchers. They were looking at the influence of ibuprofen supplementation on beneficial effects of exercise. There's specific looking at how much it initiates muscle protein synthesis. And that first talk they did, they're like, hey, it's negative effect. It's impairing the ability of exercise to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Then I heard them talk like a couple years later when they were looking at people that were chronically taking these ibuprofen medications. And they were like, hey, people that are taking those ibuprofens on a regular basis, or those non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, were adding muscle we're adding more lean mass. I was like, I walked up to them afterwards. I'm like, I think I misheard you, because I remember, unless I'm crazy, that talk a couple years ago, you said it was having a net negative effect. Their main takeaway is it's not really going to harm you in terms of stimulating muscle protein synthesis. And it's not going to dramatically, if you take ibuprofen right before exercise, it's not going to blunt that inflammatory response you get in terms of IL-6, the ones that I talked about. It's going to be another pathway that it's predominantly going to have an effect on. So short answer, no, it's not going to negatively affect the beneficial effects that you get from exercise if you take those. And if you have something like me, osteoarthritis, that prevents you from doing exercise if you're hurting, if you take those, it's going to help you do the exercise.
Looks like we have time for 2 more questions. This one's from Jennifer. When I'm under a lot of stress, it seems like I experience more inflammation in my problem joints. Why do you think that happens?
Yeah, you absolutely can. I truly believe in like the mind body connection. If we look at somebody during a period of stress, and let's say I would go to bringing them in the lab and I would draw some blood and look at quote unquote stress hormones, something like cortisol, we truly see that there's an elevation in these stress hormones. And we can subsequently see an increase in inflammation over time from that as well. We know that people that are more stressed are more likely to develop a lot of those chronic diseases that we see too, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. High levels of cortisol impair insulin receptor signaling. So yeah, you're right. If you're experiencing more stress, that does exacerbate some of those the stress hormones, those inflammatory hormones, or those inflammatory proteins. And so we know there's a link. Higher stress levels, increased risk of chronic disease, clearly probably tied to increased levels of these stress-related proteins and inflammatory-related proteins as well. Now, from my area, we do know from physical activity, what's one of the main lifestyle things we can do to reduce our stress? Exercise, physical activity, not only directly reduces those inflammatory proteins over time that we talked about, it can reduce our stress levels as well. And we can see our stress hormone levels come back down too.
And our final question comes from Connie. With localized arthritis, such as hands or feet, does exercise focused on these areas help reduce inflammation?
Yes. So there's again, there've been this research is really clear that exercise reduces the pain and progression associated with osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis. Now, more specific to localization, you got to take that. You got to be careful with that, right? I mean, because we do know there's clear studies that show you're more physically active, that can help delay the progression of osteorheumatoid arthritis. It can help bring down inflammation. That said, if you're like one of my students that might be a clinical exercise physiologist, you have to be mindful of what specific joints this person has affected. If they have, significant hip arthritis or knee arthritis, and jogging on a treadmill might not be a great idea because you can increase the damage just from the impact and stress on those joints. So in that case, when we do case studies with my students, we'd say, okay, we know that exercise and physical activity can help reduce inflammation systemically and in those localized joints. We don't want to cause increased stress or damage on those osteoarthritic joints because we know that increases localized inflammation. So we would do more non-weight bearing exercise. So biking is an example of one. A lot of the folks that I know from the Knolls of Oxford and the community do water aerobics at the rec center. So that's an example. They can do aerobic type exercise where they're decreasing the impact, the wear and tear on those joints, but they're still getting the exercise. They can help reduce the inflammation and then help decrease the damage they're doing over time to those joints and decrease their pain and disability associated with it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again to Dr. Timmerman for leading this webinar today and taking time out of his beautiful 73-degree weathered Saturday to be with us today. There is another webinar after this at 2 o'clock with Glenn Klatt about the future of virtual events. Again, thank you, Dr. Timmerman. And I do want to give a shout out to JJ Slager for being behind the scenes tech person and helping with this entire weekend in the webinar platform. So thank you to him as well.
Yeah, Emily, JJ, thank you very much.
Have a great day, everyone.